The marble floors echoed under my shoes as I stepped into the grand estate house where the will reading was to take place. The chandeliers above flickered gently, casting long shadows on a sea of polished faces, most of them family, but none of them warm. In the front row sat my grandfather, Charles Whitmore, dressed in his signature gray suit and navy tie. His posture was regal, his silver hair combed to perfection, and on his lips rested a smirk I had come to associate with victories he hadn't yet earned. He didn't look at me when I entered. He didn't have to. I could feel the weight of his judgment, the certainty in his mind that this gathering was nothing more than a formality, a legal confirmation of what he believed he already owned. A few days before, he'd said it plainly, without hesitation, without shame. You won't get a single cent from that woman's fortune. It all goes to the bloodline. That woman was Lillian, my ex-wife. And the fortune? $34 million she had built from scratch after our separation. I hadn't expected to be invited to the reading, let alone to receive anything. But when the lawyer called and said Lillian had included a personal statement in her will, I knew there was more to it than anyone in that room suspected. Grandpa sat back with folded arms, eyes half-lidded in arrogance as the lawyer opened the thick envelope labeled Last Will and Testament of Lillian M. Hawthorne. I took my seat quietly in the second row, nodding briefly at the lawyer. The air felt too still. Everyone leaned in as the lawyer cleared his throat. They thought they knew how this would end. But the final sentence hadn't been read yet. I met Lillian in college, long before either of us had anything worth measuring in dollars. She had this fire in her eyes that lit up every room, the kind of ambition you couldn't teach. We were young and broke, living off instant noodles and late-night ideas. But she believed in her dreams, and, somehow, she believed in me too. We got married fresh out of school. While I pursued a teaching job, Lillian set her sights on something far more unpredictable, a tech startup focused on adaptive learning. People laughed at her, said she was out of her depth. But I didn't. I sat with her during the long nights when her website crashed, when investors ghosted her, when she had to choose between rent and hosting fees. I wasn't rich, but I was there. I brought her tea when she hadn't slept, ran errands while she coded, and held her hand when it felt like it was all falling apart. My paycheck barely covered our bills, but my belief in her never once dipped. But somewhere along the way, we drifted. It wasn't anger or betrayal that ended us, just distance. As her company began to grow, as meetings turned into conferences and conferences into boardrooms, I watched her transform into a woman the world finally started to notice. She outgrew our tiny apartment. She outgrew the quiet life I had embraced. So we divorced, quietly, respectfully. No lawyers, no fights. Just a handshake, a shared smile, and a parting promise to remain kind. And we did. Even after the divorce, we spoke. Birthdays, holidays. Sometimes she called just to share a win. She always asked how I was doing. When my mother passed, she sent flowers and called me the moment she heard. I never told her this, but sometimes I still saved her voicemails. What most people didn't know, especially my family, was that Lillian and I still had a bond. A real one. Not romantic, not even nostalgic, just honest. She once told me, "You were the only one who saw me before the money." I don't forget that. My grandfather never approved of Lillian. He thought she was beneath us. Daughters-in-law should know their place, he once barked. When she started making money, he changed his tone, but only on the surface. Behind closed doors, he still muttered things like, she wouldn't be anything without the Whitmore name. But Lillian never needed his approval. She built her empire, all 34 million of it, without taking a dime from anyone in my family. She refused to accept their help, and she never forgot who had actually stood beside her. I never asked her for anything, not even when her company was acquired. I congratulated her and moved on with my quiet life. Teaching literature to bored teenagers, watering my garden, drinking coffee from the same chipped mug she once bought me at a thrift store. I didn't envy her success, I admired it. So when I got the call from her lawyer, saying she had included something for me in her final arrangements, I was surprised, but not entirely. Lillian didn't do anything halfway. If she loved completely. If she walked away, she walked with grace. And if she owed someone a thank you, she made sure it was heard, no matter how late. She wasn't just my ex-wife. She was the only person who ever told me I was enough, even when I had nothing. And now, in death, she was still speaking. My grandfather, Charles Whitmore, wasn't a man who tolerated challenges to his authority, especially not from women, and certainly not from one like Lillian. From the beginning, he saw her independence as rebellion, her intelligence as arrogance. When I first brought her to a family dinner, he barely looked up from his roast to mutter a grunted hello. Later that night, he said to me, "She speaks too boldly. Women like her don't last in this family." What he really meant was, she won't bend to me. And she never did. Even after the wedding, Grandpa kept his distance. He made no effort to bond with her. No invitations, no warm gestures. Lillian brushed it off, too focused on building her business to care about inherited cold shoulders. She was raised on her own merits, not anyone else's validation. That made Grandpa furious. He believed lineage was currency, and she had none of it. When we divorced, I remember the faint smile that curled on his lips. He didn't offer comfort. Instead, he said, "Finally came to your senses. Should have never married her in the first place." And just like that, he began his campaign to erase her from my life completely. He started slipping comments into conversations like poison. "Don't answer her calls. She's probably using you for something. Let her be someone else's burden now." I didn't listen, but I didn't argue either. I learned long ago that arguing with Charles Whitmore was like trying to reason with a wall that judged you while it stood taller than you ever could. But Grandpa wasn't content with the divorce. No, in his mind, Lillian's success still had the Whitmore stamp on it. "She used our name," he'd say to anyone who would listen. "Married into the family, then made her fortune. That money, it's ours by extension." He started working the back channels, subtly pressuring extended family, cousins, second uncles, anyone who still had access to Lillian. A phone call here, a suggestion there. He told Aunt Margaret to remind Lillian where her roots were. Told my cousin Jordan, who once worked for Lillian's company, to hint that the Whitmores had helped pave her road. What he really wanted was the lion's share of the estate. Not because he needed it, but because he believed it was owed. A reward for the family name. A reward for being a Whitmore. I heard whispers at family gatherings. Is already set to get at least a quarter of it. She'd be a fool not to give him something. Look what the family did for her. I'd sit there quietly, biting my tongue, thinking, you all think she owes you for watching her climb a ladder you didn't even help build. When I once gently suggested that Lillian might have her own ideas for her legacy, Grandpa laughed. "She'll do what's proper," he said. "And if not, well, there are ways to persuade people, even in death." Those words echoed now in the lawyer's office, as Grandpa sat smug and certain in the front row. He thought he'd won. He thought his quiet manipulation had worked. He didn't know Lillian like I did, and he had no idea what was about to hit him. The air in the lawyer's office felt thick, too thick for a spring morning. Maybe it was the velvet curtains drawn halfway closed, or maybe it was a weight of $34 million floating silently in the room like invisible smoke. The conference table was long and dark, polished to the point where it reflected the overhead light like a mirror of judgment. Every seat was taken. Lillian's distant cousins, former employees, even people I didn't recognize, all invited. Not because they were close to her, but because they hoped to be remembered in her will. Some wore sympathetic expressions. Others couldn't even hide the gleam in their eyes. One man beside me whispered, "She never liked me, but you never know." Another woman across the room was already clutching her purse as if bracing to carry something valuable out. At the head of the table sat Mr. Dorsey, Lillian's longtime estate attorney, a man of few words and thinner patience. He wore a dark suit and wire-rimmed glasses, a red folder laid neatly before him, the words "Last Will and Testament" stamped in elegant gold. His hands were steady, practiced. This wasn't his first reading. But something about today, perhaps the weight of the room, made even him pause for a second before beginning. Grandpa sat front and center, of course. His hands were folded on the table, back straight like a judge, not a beneficiary. He didn't speak, didn't even glance around. Just waited, like he already knew the outcome. When I walked in, he looked at me briefly, just long enough to lift one eyebrow. Not a greeting, a warning, a reminder, you don't belong here. I took my seat in the second row, nodded to Mr. Dorsey, and stayed quiet. The lawyer cleared his throat. This is the official reading of the last will and testament of Ms. Lillian M. Hawthorne, witnessed, notarized, and verified in accordance with state law. I will begin with preliminary bequests as outlined in Part 1 of the document. There was a shuffle of bodies leaning slightly forward. To Ms. Sharon Fields, I leave $10,000 in gratitude for your years of administrative service. A polite smile from the older woman in the corner, who looked genuinely touched. She even wiped a tear. She had earned it. To Mr. Travis Young, $15,000 and full rights to the lakeside cabin in Vermont. Use it well, as you once told me you would. The man gave a soft laugh. She remembered that, he muttered. His voice cracked. To the Children's Book Fund, a donation of $250,000 for the advancement of literacy in underserved schools. That one earned a round of respectful nods, the kind of bequest that polished Lillian's legacy. But even then, I saw the flicker of disappointment ripple through the room like a ripple across water. Everyone was waiting for the bigger numbers. The real numbers. Grandpa hadn't moved. He just blinked slowly, breathing evenly through his nose, like a man about to collect his crown. More names followed. A gardener, a foundation, a former professor, all gifts between $10,000 and $50,000, all deliberate, thoughtful, but nowhere near what the vultures in the room had come for. To Mr. Jordan Whitmore, that name drew attention. My cousin straightened. A sum of $35,000 in acknowledgement of your early service to my company, though brief and poorly executed. A few heads turned, stunned. Even I had to bite back a smile. Lillian had always been honest, even when she was subtle. The tension in the room was mounting now. We were 20 minutes into the reading, and the major players hadn't yet been mentioned. Especially me. I could feel eyes turning toward me, wondering if I'd been left out completely. I was Lillian's ex-husband, after all, divorced, legally disconnected. I had no biological tie, no claim, no expectation, and yet, here I was, calmly waiting. Mr. Dorsey paused to take a sip of water, maybe for dramatic effect, maybe because he was about to pivot into the heart of the will. I glanced at Grandpa. His smirk hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. He was waiting for the fireworks, the part where he walked out of this office with enough zeros to add a few digits to his legacy. He leaned ever so slightly forward as Mr. Dorsey continued. To Mr. Charles Whitmore. And there it was. The room collectively inhaled. But I noticed something different in Mr. Dorsey's voice. A strange composure, like someone holding back a punchline. Grandpa didn't flinch. He already saw it. Millions pouring into his accounts, property deeds transferring effortlessly, the public headline that would follow. Whitmore patriarch reclaims family fortune. He had no idea what was coming next. And still, no mention of me. Not yet. Mr. Dorsey's voice was cool and steady as he read the line that made every head in the room swivel toward the front. To Mr. Charles Whitmore, he said, pausing briefly, eyes scanning the page, a sum total of $2 million as a token of acknowledgement for being part of the journey. A murmur swept through the room like a gust of wind. $2 million. It was an enormous amount, life-changing for most, but far less than the lion's share Grandpa had convinced everyone, including himself, he was due. Still, he smiled, a smirk that had grown roots in his expression. He slowly turned his head and looked straight at me. Winked. The kind of wink that said, see? The kind of grin that whispered, I always win. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced together behind his head like he'd just watched a checkmate fall into place. No words needed to be spoken. His smugness said it all. He had just collected $2 million from a woman he spent years mocking, undermining, and dismissing. And he saw it as proof that even Lillian, in her last breath, had bowed to him. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. But inside, something stirred. Because I knew what was coming. He didn't. As the next few minor names were called and their amounts read off, I slipped into memory, back to a small manila envelope that had arrived a few weeks before her death. It was postmarked from Lillian's company headquarters. No return address. Just her initials, LMH, written in sharp pen. Inside, a handwritten letter. 4 pages. Folded neatly, her signature perfume still faint on the paper. I hadn't read it at first. Just stared at it for hours, afraid of what it might say. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Our last conversation had been short, friendly, but distant. I thought she had moved on completely. I'd made peace with that. But when I finally opened the letter, I cried. Not from grief, but from recognition, from memory, from the aching warmth of being seen after so long. I never forgot the way you carried me through the storm, she wrote. Before I was Lillian Hawthorne, CEO, I was the girl subbing at a dining table at 2 a.m., and you were the man holding my hand without asking questions. She talked about the early days, how I used to edit her business plans, how I sold my old car to fund her first beta site, how I stayed up while she cried over rejection emails. Things she never acknowledged aloud, but always remembered. You were the only one who never asked me to change. You just believed, and that belief built something bigger than both of us. She ended the letter with one simple line. If there's anything I've learned from building a fortune, it's that true wealth is gratitude repaid. That sentence alone made me close my eyes and breathe deep. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but now, sitting in this crowded office, with Grandpa basking in his $2 million victory, I felt the weight of it press against my chest like an unopened treasure. Grandpa, meanwhile, was enjoying his moment. He leaned toward me slightly, that same smug sparkle in his eye, and whispered under his breath, "You shouldn't have left her, boy. You're lucky she even invited you to this circus." I didn't answer. He chuckled, tapping the table gently with a finger. "Imagine if you'd stayed. Might have had something real to your name instead of that empty teacher's salary." It was amazing, really, how blind he remained. How he thought love, kindness, and loyalty were currency you could only measure in gold. He saw my silence as defeat. He saw her acknowledgement of him, even that small amount, as a concession. But it wasn't. It was a line in a ledger that was far from balanced. I looked around the room again. Eyes still danced between us. The crowd wasn't sure what to make of it. Why hadn't Lillian left her ex-husband anything? Why had the former father-in-law, the cold, stern patriarch, walked away with $2 million? Had he somehow redeemed himself in her final days? They didn't know the truth. The real truth. Lillian had always been strategic, always one step ahead. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat again. "There are a few remaining clauses yet to be read," he said calmly. "Special provisions, as outlined by Ms. Hawthorne in a separate document titled Final Directives." Grandpa's eyebrows twitched slightly. Just a flicker, maybe confusion, maybe curiosity, but not concern. Not yet. I sat still, heart steady now. I could feel the storm gathering, the shift in the air. The final act was approaching, and no one, not even the man who thought he ruled the room, was ready for it. Especially him. Because what Lillian had left behind wasn't just money. It was truth, and it was about to be read aloud. Mr. Dorsey looked up from the wheel and adjusted his glasses, a quiet rustling echoing as he flipped to a thinner, hand-folded piece of parchment tucked in the back of the folder. He pressed his palm flat against it, the gold ring on his finger catching the light. "There's one final clause," he said, voice notably softer. The murmurs in the room died down immediately. Chairs stopped creaking. Breath seemed suspended. "This," he continued, "is a personal letter written by Ms. Hawthorne in her own handwriting. She requested it be read aloud at the conclusion of the official will." I felt my breath lodge in my throat. He unfolded the page slowly. There were no dramatic flourishes, just his calm voice reading her words. "To those gathered here, if you're hearing this, it means I've already gone. And if that's the case, well, that means I get the last word." I always liked that. A few people chuckled nervously. Even I smiled. That was Lillian's voice, through and through. Even in death, she spoke with clarity, with wit, and with an underlying sharpness that was never cruel, only honest. I want to begin by thanking everyone who played a role in my life, even the difficult ones. They taught me lessons. They shaped my resolve. They made me stronger. Grandpa shifted slightly in his chair. But there's one person, one constant, who never asked me for anything, who never demanded recognition, who never once stepped in front of my light, even when he helped build it. I could feel every eye in the room slowly turning toward me. His name is James Whitmore. He's my ex-husband, and he's the reason I ever had the courage to try. My chest tightened. Back when I was nobody, when I had $700 to my name and a website crashing every 3 days, James was the one who stayed up all night helping me rebuild it. He offered ideas, rewrote my proposals, made sure I ate, and sold his own car to fund my first marketing campaign. He didn't complain. He didn't brag. He just said, "You've got this, Lil," and made me believe it. I looked down at my hands, remembering the very day I handed her that envelope full of the car's sale money. She cried on our kitchen floor. I divorced him not because he failed me, the letter continued, but because I grew faster than our lives could stretch. And yet, even after we went our separate ways, he never turned bitter. He never took credit. He never reminded me of what I owed. A pause. Dorsey's voice quivered slightly, just once. There's a promise I once made. A quiet one. I whispered it to myself the night my company turned its first profit. If I ever make it, James will never need to ask. Grandpa leaned forward now, visibly unsettled. His jaw stiffened. Hands tightened in his lap. I know many of you expected something different. Some of you believe my fortune belongs to those with the same last name. But the truth is, legacy isn't built on blood. It's built on love, on loyalty, on silence when silence is heavier than gold. Mr. Dorsey turned the page. And so, he read, "To the man who never asked for anything, I leave $28 million. The silence was deafening. No one spoke. No one breathed. For a second, the room itself felt suspended in air. 28 million. I didn't move. Didn't blink. I just felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. Grandpa let out a half-choked cough. That's absurd," he muttered, his voice breaking the hush. "She was my daughter-in-law. I'm the patriarch of this family." "She was your former daughter-in-law," Mr. Dorsey said plainly, "and she's no longer obligated to honor your expectations. She only got where she did because she married into our name," Grandpa hissed. I finally looked up, eyes locking with his. Calmly, clearly, I said, "No. She got there because she refused to let your name define her." Gasps rippled again, but I didn't feel pride. I felt peace. Mr. Dorsey placed the letter down gently, then pulled a second envelope from his folder and slid it across the table toward me. "This contains the transfer instructions," he said. I didn't even reach for it. I was still trying to breathe through the wave of emotion swelling inside my chest. Lillian. She had remembered every quiet thing I'd done. Things I never reminded her of. She had known all along, and she had waited for the right moment to say thank you in the only way she could now. The room was buzzing with murmurs now. Grandpa stood up, shaking, his hands clenched. "This isn't over," he barked. Mr. Dorsey didn't even lift his eyes. "Actually," he said gently, "it is." And just like that, the man who thought he controlled every room walked out without a word more. Meanwhile, I sat frozen, the envelope before me, her words echoing again and again in my ears. "If I ever make it, you'll never need to ask." And I never did. The silence that followed Mr. Dorsey's final sentence wasn't just silence. It was the kind of quiet that weighed on the skin, pressed against the ribs, filled every breath. It was the vacuum left behind when certainty crumbles. And in this room, certainty had a name: Charles Whitmore. Gasps had echoed around the room when the figure was read. $28 million, left to the man no one had expected to matter. The man everyone had thought was irrelevant. The ex-husband. Me. Grandpa's face had frozen. That ever-present smirk, once carved into stone, was now flickering. He stared at the lawyer, then at me, then back at the paper in Mr. Dorsey's hands, as if willing the words to rearrange themselves. His mouth parted slightly, not in confusion, but in disbelief. as if the laws of the world he'd always known had just been rewritten. I sat still. The envelope rested in front of me, untouched. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, trembling only slightly. My eyes were fixed on the table, not to hide but to hold myself together. My throat was dry, my vision blurred at the edges, because beneath the calm, beneath the restraint, there were tears, not of greed or shock, but of overwhelming remembrance, of late nights and whispered encouragements, of watching Lillian walk away, still proud of the woman she was becoming, of knowing, deep down, that we never stopped believing in each other, even after love had left the room. Then Grandpa broke the silence. "This is a mistake," he snapped, rising from his chair so quickly it scraped the polished floor. "He was her ex. This is insanity. Why would she give him, anything?" Mr. Dorsey didn't flinch. He simply folded the letter and placed it back into the folder. "Her instructions," he said evenly, "were clear and final." Grandpa looked around, eyes wide, seeking support. But there was none. The room had turned awkward, brittle. Those who once laughed at his jokes, nodded at his opinions, now looked down at their hands or anywhere else but at him. There was no applause for arrogance now, no respect for a crown worn too tightly. Aunt Margaret coughed. Jordan crossed his arms and leaned back. Even the family friend who used to echo Grandpa's disdainful remarks was now silently avoiding eye contact. "This is ridiculous," Grandpa muttered again, softer now. The authority was leaking from his voice. The power, so thick just minutes ago, was slipping through his fingers like dust. He turned toward the door. I expected him to storm out. That would have been more in character, dramatic, volatile. But instead, he simply gathered his coat with stiff fingers, straightened his back, and began to walk. He was trying to walk with dignity, but everyone saw it. The heaviness in his steps, the tension in his jaw, the slight tremble in his left hand. This was not the walk of a man victorious. This was the quiet exit of someone who had bet everything on pride and lost to love. As he passed me, he paused. For a heartbeat. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He only looked at me, not with rage, not with hatred, but with something worse. Confusion. For the first time in my life, Charles Whitmore didn't know what to say. He had no words to dress the wound Lillian had left with one final act of truth. No clever insult, no cutting remark, just silence. And I met his eyes, not with gloating, not with triumph, but with stillness. Because this was never about beating him. This was about being seen. And finally, I was. The next morning, the city was quiet, the kind of quiet you only hear in the early hours before the world wakes. A gentle fog clung to the ground as I drove the winding road that led to Hillcrest Cemetery. I hadn't been there since the funeral, not because I wanted to forget, but because I wasn't ready to remember. The wrought iron gates creaked open, welcoming me not with grandeur, but with a stillness that felt sacred. I parked beside the small marble sign etched with the words "Garden of Serenity" and stepped out, envelope still in my coat pocket, though by now it felt more like a symbol than a document. Lillian's headstone was exactly where I remembered it, third row, second path from the left, beneath the large cherry blossom tree she used to photograph every spring. Even now, a few petals clung to the last of the branches, trembling in the breeze. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, the wind cold on my face. No word came at first, just memories. The sound of her laugh, the tilt of her head when she challenged me, the way she used to leave post-it notes with quotes on the fridge like miniature sermons. She hated grand gestures but loved purpose. She didn't believe in fate, but she believed in momentum, in movement, in fire, in building. She'd built an empire from nothing, and all the while, never asked for permission, never asked to be approved. And now, even in death, she hadn't asked for applause. She had simply chosen to say thank you in the most Lillian way possible. I should have said more, I finally whispered, the words catching in my throat. Should have told you how proud I was, how much I admired you, how grateful I am. I crouched down and brushed a fallen petal off the stone. It was smooth, clean, someone had been taking care of it. Maybe one of her assistants. Maybe one of the volunteers she used to mentor. I never expected anything from you, I said. Not this, not all of this. But you knew. You always knew. The air was still. The city behind me buzzed. But time had paused, just long enough for me to feel her presence settle into the morning. I pulled the envelope from my pocket. It didn't matter anymore what the numbers were. It could have been $28 or $28 million. The truth in it was the same. She remembered me not as her ex, but as her beginning. I stood up, took a deep breath, and said the words I'd never said even when she was alive. Thank you for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself. I left a small white rose at the base of her headstone, not because it was tradition, but because she once told me white roses reminded her of clean slates. Like a blank page, she said, waiting to be written on. That's when I knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the first line of a new chapter. Back at home, I sat at the desk where I used to edit her early grant proposals. The desk was older now, scratched, dull, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and named it the Lillian Foundation. That same afternoon, I called Mr. Dorsey and told him I would be transferring a significant portion of the inheritance, $10 million to start, to fund the launch of a nonprofit in her name. Its mission, to support underfunded female entrepreneurs with ideas the world laughed at. Ideas that sounded too bold, too early, too risky, just like Hayes once had. No one else believed in her, I said to him. So I want this foundation to believe in those women who stand where she once stood. He paused. She would have liked that. No, I said. She would have done that. I'm just following her lead. The rest of the funds I placed in a trust for educational programs in tech innovation, mentorship, and scholarship grants. I named one program Lil Labs, a nod to the name of the notebook she always carried, scribbled with wild diagrams and half-coded interfaces. That notebook now sat in a shadow box on my shelf, beside our wedding photo, not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I wanted to honor the truth of it. We hadn't ended in failure. We had evolved into something most people don't get, a legacy of mutual respect, of knowing we mattered to each other, in ways deeper than romance. She gave me more than a second chance at wealth. She gave me a voice I'd forgotten I had. It's funny. Everyone thought the story was about the money, about the will, about the shocking twist. But the real twist was this: love doesn't always stay in the form you first find it in. Sometimes it grows into memory, sometimes into gratitude, and sometimes into a mission. A year later, on the anniversary of her passing, I stood before a crowd of 300 young women at the Foundation's first grant ceremony. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't speak from a script. I just told them the truth. I once knew a woman, I began, who was told she talked too loud, dreamed too big, and asked for too much. She was told to shrink herself. She didn't. Instead, she built something, and when she was done building, she left behind the tools for others to do the same. That night, I sat beneath the cherry blossom tree again, this time on the campus courtyard at university she once dreamed of speaking at. They'd invited me instead, posthumously naming a lecture series after her. And as I watched the petals fall, I didn't feel rich. I didn't feel famous. I felt full. She hadn't left me money. She left me her voice. And I'll make sure the world hears it.